I tell Charlie just to, no, I'm just kidding. He can do that. All right, verse 26. Genesis 1, verse 26. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and over all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that is fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is the first of two stories that we have of the creation account in the Bible. And this first one depicts this generous God creating and organizing all of creation into this beautiful, abundant, very good environment of vitality and resources. It's this cosmos. The idea of the language here is that you should be thinking about just the bursting forth of all that God has intended creation to be. And we didn't even read all the first part of this chapter. He just goes through all the layers of creation and all that God is doing intentionally in each layer to bring forth his design, his goodness, his heart into creation. And what you should recognize as you read all of this account is that God is hosting humanity. He is making space to care for humanity. Adam, or mankind, in other words, is provided for with all the other living creatures, right? And apparently we were all supposed to be vegetarians early on. That's what it seems like. But they're provided with all they need to not just survive, but to thrive in this good creation. The vast array of heavens and earth are imagined to be this procession going before God as he rests and delights in his creation. We just had our basement finished. Well, we just finished our basement over the last month and a half. And at every little step of the way, I would take Rachel down there and I'd be like, look what I did to this wall, you know? And I'd have her stare at the wall and she'd be like, good job, honey, you know? And we would have friends come over and we'd be like, guys, come downstairs and just look at this countertop, you know? And they'd be like, good. They don't know the difference from what it used to look like or what it looked like a construction zone. Oh, good job, guys. You're doing really good. You know, but there's something in creating. When you do create something, you take pride in it. And anybody who's built a doghouse or whatever you've done, you find yourself just kind of at the end of the day, after you've built it, you go back out and you just look at it again. Yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about? If you've ever planted something in your front yard, you've planted it, you've moved on, but a couple times a day, you just go look at it again. That guy did a pretty good job planting that. You know what I'm talking about? This is God. He's just delighting. He's resting in all that he's made, this good, vibrant creation. And then he says to humanity, be fruitful in this, grow in this, grow in number, increase, fill the earth with all this goodness. Subdue it. And it's not conquering language. This is inheritance language. This is stewardship of the plenty that God has provided. In the second story of the creation, we won't read it, but you read it in Genesis chapter 2. It starts it again. It just tells it from a different way. The text describes this beautiful, lush garden filled with valuable materials to build and build cities and adorn them, and to build homes and to provide food and sustainability for the men and women of humanity, and to flourish in their families and to grow in this creative, loving generosity of God, and to help it spread across the earth. The Bible begins with this poetic image of a generous creator. A generous God, forming a generous creation to cultivate a generous people who will bear his image in the world. A couple of weeks ago, we were at our staff retreat in upstate New York, and I got a little ping from Phil Seaton saying, did you send this email out? And I said, what email? And he sent me a screenshot of this email that said, Pastor Elias at pioneervalley@gmail.com, something like that. And it was asking, hey, please reach out to me. I'm in an emergency, kind of a thing. And I mean, my first cue is to anybody is that I'm not pastor, right? We don't call ourselves pastor, but I mean, that's fine language if you like to use it. It's just a little quirky for me sometimes. I get my religious triggers start going off. But it was there. It was this Gmail account that had been set up, and it had my profile picture with Rachel from the website, and it had been going out to members and people, and they're asking for them to get back to them so that then they can, can you help me out? I just need some gift cards. I really am in an emergency. Please don't call me because I'm about to go into meetings, but just reply to this email, ... right? And I was like, oh man, people are phishing using my identity and role here in the church to try to get money from people. I don't even know how they got the list. I don't know any of that stuff yet, but sometimes you just sit back and you go, how did we go from this garden of goodness and all this stuff and generous God and generous people to Gmail scams, right? Like what's happened? But there's been this story that has been told, the story that there's not enough, and that we need to get more by whatever means possible in order to be secure, in order to thrive, in order to succeed. And many of us believe this story on some level. Yeah. Ecclesiastes 4, verse 4 says, the author says, and I saw that all toil and achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind, which is an often refrain in the book of Ecclesiastes. What happens in Genesis 3 if you keep reading? A great deception falls over humanity. It's the lie that God is not generous. In fact, he's holding out on you. The boundaries and limitations of your humanity in relationship to others and to creation are set in such a way that you will not be getting all that you can if you trust him. You need to take control and manifest your will be done. And with the acceptance of that lie, we see humanity quickly turned to violence and fractured families and sufferings, along with kingdoms and powers that oppress and rule over others, and the force of violence as a central part of the biblical narrative from then on. The vision of the garden is attempted to be manufactured through wealth and through kingdoms, but it's never what it's meant to be. It always ends up corrupted by human greed and ego and power. And so it may not be that we make fake Gmail accounts. Hopefully you're not making any fake Gmail accounts, right? But it may be that we just remain close-fisted to the needs of those around us because it risks us not being able to get ahead of our neighbor in some category. Resources, material goods, food, money, etc. And that can be true for individuals or whole communities of people, even church communities at times. The formation of many of us in the Christian faith is that we make kind of the occasional donation here and there, but generally we're postured towards others with the belief that there's just still not enough. That there's not enough square footage, there's not enough clothing and time and pleasure and money and power and position and sales and success and room on the road or whatever, right? True. And I have to accumulate more wherever I can. In fact, we put spiritual language to it and we say, well, I'm just going to make the most of every opportunity. Because we're convinced that somehow more will make us more content or more happy. And that those who have more than us are more satisfied in life. This is the story that drives much of the progress of the world, like the author says. It's the perplexing narrative that fuels the rise and grind mentality of those who are already at the top 10% of the world's income. If you are the average American today, you are in the top 10% of the world's income. You're living wealthier than the wealthiest person on planet Earth 100 years ago. Yeah. You have air conditioning. You can control your climate. You have air conditioning. You have internet. You have Amazon Prime and Netflix, whatever, right? Like we're always comparing our kids' kind of expectations of life to what we grew up with, and I'm sure you did that with your kids and so on and so forth, right? But it's like, are you kidding me? You think you can just like push a button and things show up? Like you can, but that's not how it works. We have more than enough. But these facts don't stop us from being within the top 5 of the most overworked countries in the world. America ranks 55 out of 60 countries for the imbalance of work life. Why? Why are we working so hard? Why are we striving so hard when we already have so much? Because deep down, we've bought the lie that says happiness and contentment and satisfaction and peace and meaning and blessedness will be available if we just have a little more. Yep. It's in the DNA. That the famous quote from John D. Rockefeller, right, who was a billionaire at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, he so famously was asked by an interviewer, how much money is enough money? And he replied, just a little bit more. How much is enough for you? How much is enough from you? I think if we're honest with ourselves today, most of us would say, just a little bit more. Like just a little bit more and I'll be good. Not just money, but all things, right? Just a little bit more, and then I'll be all right. Our families are falling apart, but we're advancing in our careers. We haven't slept in the same bedroom as our spouse for years, but we're paying the bills. Our health, physically and mentally, is deteriorating, but we're eating constantly, being entertained constantly in new clothes all the time. Clothes, by the way, which were created overseas for $2 a day and poisoned the people making them. And yet the U.S. has the highest chronic disease burden and obesity rate that is 2 times higher than the world average. When you have everything you need and yet you believe you need more, what happens to the human psychology? We are at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. Like we are obsessed now with this self-actualization. It drives our economy, it drives our lives because we've got no place else to go. All the needs are met. And so to navigate our lives, we're living in this culture that's undergoing a crisis of meaning. So much so significant that we're willing to give our identity over to a politician or a sexual preference or a brand or a clothing style or a genre of music or a hobby or a sports team or whatever. Because all the needs are met and we're in a crisis of meaning. All of which monetize our discontent, by the way. Right. One of the fundamental issues that we live with one of our fundamental issues is that we live as though there is not enough, but we actually have too much. And in the absence of generosity and the view of generosity in the world and a generous God, we are consumed with anxiety and worry and fear over material pursuits. What do we do? Enter Jesus. in his most famous sermon with remarkably an audience that is mostly made up of subsistence living people who are under the oppressive occupation of Rome at the time, who are being taxed into poverty violently, he gives instructions on generosity, on giving to the needy, on storing up sky treasure. Al Kingan's going to teach us about that in a couple weeks. And to this poor, oppressed people that he teaches about generosity and this way of life in the kingdom, he comes to earth and he says this in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. Let me just turn there. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life. All right. What you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear, is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable? He's asking a rhetorical question for you to sit with. Yeah. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Funny how worrying doesn't add, it just seems to take away, right? Don't worry about your life. Don't worry about food or clothes, about cars and phones, about scholarships and mortgages, about your annual review at work, about how your 401k is doing in the elections that are upcoming, about the future of the church, and about gas prices and rent increases and that weird clicking in your shoulder that always shows up when you go to scratch your ear, and your kid, if he'll grow out of that, or if you'll find the one, or if the one that you found will ever change, if nuclear war is imminent, and if the future of AI robots will end us all. Or at least don't worry about food and clothes. The antidote Jesus offers to worry and hurry and a scarcity mentality and the posture of not enough is to take some time to notice birds and flowers. Birds and flowers, and to recognize that life is fundamentally designed as a generous garden of provision. And that if you will trust God again, and if you will live according to the teachings Jesus is teaching, you'll begin to realize the true value of life, the true value of you, the true value of your neighbor. His instruction is not to get more disciplined to get ahead of things if you're worried. Just get up a little earlier and get things done. It's not to micromanage outcomes. It's not to try and add time to things. You can't, even with daylight savings time, right? We learned that this morning. He also isn't teaching to give into irresponsibility or apathy or this kind of low ambition life. Jesus comes to reinstate a generous view of the Creator. To reclaim the truth that God is kind and good and trustworthy. And you don't have to believe the lie. And the way one does that in verse 33 is he says to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. And then he says all these things will be given to you as well. You'll be taken care of. Jesus, His teachings are to orient your energies towards life in the direction of His kingdom and in His righteousness. And he says, ultimately, that will form you into the kind of person who doesn't worry about food and clothes. Why? Because the outcome of a life lived in full trust and obedience to Jesus' teachings will amount to an identity, not just a belief system that you can post about or argue about, but an identity of who you are that is convinced of the love and generosity of God. A generous God produces a generous people. But we must choose to live our lives in God through the teachings of Jesus to get that from our minds into our bones. roots into who we are. Jesus comes to cultivate a generous people who will bear the image of a generous God to a world convinced of scarcity. A quick note on the idea of seeking his kingdom and his righteousness, because unfortunately a lot of damage has been done through manipulative, power-hungry people, violent men who try to take the kingdom by force. Do you know what I'm talking about? Seeking the kingdom and his righteousness is not about giving financially to the church. There's a false doctrine, mostly referred to as the prosperity gospel, that says the more money you give to a church or a ministry, the better your life will be, more healthy and more prosperous. What you notice quickly about this doctrine, wherever it's preached, is that the healthy and prosperous people are the one preaching it. They're the ones who get the most healthy and the most prosperous, conveniently enough. If someone like the apostles were any indication of the outcome of a way of life committed to Jesus and what it would be like, then we have a very different discipleship presented in the prosperity gospel than we do in the New Testament. Each of them would suffer poverty and persecution, many to the point of martyrdom. Jesus himself was put on a cross, not a Rolls Royce. And he called all of us to follow him into a generous self-offering to the world around us in order to show the love of God, not in order to make our material situation better. Some subcategories around this teaching include things like the man of God teaching. And some of us come from traditions where this was taught, that somehow the pastor or the minister or the head of the nonprofit organization that calls itself a church but really runs more like a business is somehow closer to God or anointed by God. And that what you do for him or give to him will somehow matter more to God because of that. Some of us come from this tradition, and that also is not accurate to the teachings of Jesus or the New Testament. James says what you do for orphans and widows is actually what matters to God. Are you with me right there? Not what you do for the pastor. By the way, I'm very grateful for people who are generous and kind and hospitable to us. It always means a lot, but it doesn't mean you're doing anything extracurricular for God in that. You're treating me like a brother and a sister should. And there is no rank in the kingdom of God. There are roles. I have a role, and maybe different than your role in the church, but there's not a rank. We are all equal at the foot of the cross. Another subcategory of this false teaching is that you have to give a tithe in order for it to count. If you give anything less, you're not really seeking the kingdom. Do you know what I'm talking about? And this has led, unfortunately, many people to give when they financially shouldn't give. Like it actually puts them into debt or it hurts them financially in a way that they end up having to give. They become indebted to others in the process of trying to meet this threshold. It also has, given too many people, I think, the idea that if they can't give that, they just won't give. And for other people, it's given them kind of the false security that, well, I give a tithe. It's quiet right now, but I think that's okay. Seeking the kingdom and his righteousness first does not mean that you give a tithe financially. There is no teaching in the New Testament that commands disciples of Jesus to give a tithe of their finances to the church. You will not find it. Tithe was set up for the Levitical priesthood in the Old Testament because they didn't inherit land when they went to the Promised Land. And it was a way for all of the community to take care of them with food. Are you with me right there? And so you gave a tenth of your harvest. The tithe in Malachi 3 was given to the temple and went into what was called the storehouse. The storehouse was filled with food and resources for the priesthood. And in the event of famine or war or scarcity, the temple could give to the community of the resources of grain and food. Are you with me right there? It did not promise that if you tithe money to the church, God will pour out blessing on your life individually. That's not in the Old Testament. Malachi is communal language. He's talking to a nation of people. He's prophetically speaking to a nation of people. The church didn't exist in the Old Testament. And neither Jesus nor the apostles teach that you have to give 10% of your money to the church. What do they teach? Paul teaches for us to give consistently, joyfully, and sacrificially. That will depend on your situation, though. I love what Helena said today, that it's about giving out of what you've received from God. And that may be very different based on your station in life, based on your income level, based on many factors. But it's about a practice of generosity and care for the community of the church that you belong to. That's why you give, not because you're commanded to give a certain amount in order to be blessed. Last thing on this teaching, I know I'm going a little longer on a short thing. Along with this teaching is, again, for many of us in this tradition, especially if you were raised in Western Protestant in the last 100 years or so, is that if you give more, you'll receive more. Do you know that? It's kind of like the bigger financial offering, the bigger the blessing, baby. As the guy buys a new Rolls Royce or a new Range Rover or adds a landing strip to his mansion or whatever, right? Also, none of that is founded in the New Testament. You have to interpret scriptures through the prosperity gospel in order to get there. None of the apostles give us that. People in the early church gave to the work of the church and to the work of caring for others because they were following Jesus. Period. Not because somehow it was going to amount to a financial blessing in their lives. Not because somehow in doing that, they could then grab a hold of the promises of God and say, God, you owe me, I gave. Generosity flowed. Some gave sales of homes and fields to the work of the church. Some gave their income. Some gave what they could, even small amounts in poverty. Paul says, in the midst of very severe trial, they're overflowing with joy, and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. He says, for I testify that they gave as much as they were able, even more than they were able. This is the Macedonians. Where did their generosity come from? From their poverty. And their joy through trials, because they were participating in the kingdom. Something like the life of Jesus is why they gave. And it amounted to generous offerings to others. Rachel and I, we have always given sacrificially and joyfully and consistently. We give here to the Pioneer Valley Church, even though we're employed by the Pioneer Valley Church, which don't think about that too deeply because it's a little bit of a weird loop there, right? But it's where we fellowship. It's the community of God we belong to. It's where we want to give to see God move and thrive in this fellowship. We give more than 10% of our net income annually, but we don't do so because we're convinced God will somehow give us back. God has been so generous to us. And if you and I sat somewhere and I just confessed my sin to you, it'd be very clear it's not because of some righteous act. Right. Least of which would be giving financially. God has been so kind. But he's generous. That's who he is. Jesus says, look, the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's just who God is. It's not about how much you're giving financially. It's just who God is. But what he's trying to create in you is a reality that he is that generous, so that you will be generous, so that those who believe the world is not generous will see God. Jesus wants you to seek his way of living under the reign of God. That's this idea of seeking the kingdom. Through practicing his teachings, that's this idea of righteousness or right living, so that you understand something fundamentally true. God is generous and trustworthy and good. And in view of things, it becomes who you are, not just something you do. You offer yourself to the world around you because you are convinced that that is who God is to you. And you discover how much in that process God has offered to you, how valuable you really are in his eyes. There's this reciprocal relationship there. Chicken or the egg? I don't know. Do you have to give to figure out how much you find out how much you're valued and then you give? I don't know. But just do something with it. Try it out. Yeah. Jesus says you won't be disappointed. Okay. Jesus teaches that we might learn to seek rest in God's generosity. That's the goal. He wants us to find rest in God's generosity. You don't have to worry. The birds are not worried about being birds. The flowers are not worried about being flowers. And they're at the threat of being cut down and thrown into the fire all the time, drying out, not having enough. But they're not worried about it, because God has set it up to be generous to them. How much more are you valuable than they? Jesus comes to tell us there is another story. The story before Genesis 3 can be experienced in our lives and in the lives of others through our lives. It's the story that there is enough. In fact, there's more than enough to go around. And that God is trustworthy and generous if we will live into his intended design. Jesus trusted this teaching so much that he went to the cross for us. For the joy set before him, he became nothing. He took on our poverty because he was convinced that God is generous and trustworthy, and that a life lived that way will show the rest of the world that truth. We have great examples of this in our community. You know, somebody else reached out to me. Beverly Noah called me when I got that fake Gmail account. And such a sweetheart, she said, she left a voicemail saying, "Hey, Elias, I heard that you're in trouble. If you need any help, I'm available. I can run to the store and get you what you need." Isn't that sweet? I called her. I'm like, "It's scam. Please don't buy anything. Please don't buy anything," right? But just a generous outlook towards the world. Say, "I have enough. I could do something." I appreciate our church and the Vision Fund we just gave to. We've given more than we've given in many years. If you're new to our community or you're just visiting with us today, we collected a Vision Fund last week, and we've collected more than $50,000 at this point. And that money goes it goes out of our church. It goes supporting churches in Europe, across Europe, that are Eastern Europe, Ukraine, churches that are really going through hard times. It goes to support local church plantings. It goes to some of our missional work here in the Pioneer Valley. We even have a fund set up to just give to our neighbors who are not a part of our fellowship, to give to organizations or to people who come into our church from our neighborhood and just say, "We need help." And we've been able to give out hotel stays for single mothers in the midst of transition, going from not having a house and waiting for another situation so they don't have to sleep in their car with their kids. We've been able to put them up in a hotel for a night or two. We've been able to give to grants here, or to communities that help do good here in the community of Pioneer Valley. We're trying to support our community and connect with our community through these funds. We did a brunch this year, just inviting guests and homeless and whoever to come and just have some food with us and eat with us. We're trying to experiment. How do we give more? How do we be more generous to the people around us? And I just want to commend you as a church, as a community, for your faith in that experimentation. I know it's we're trying to figure it out together, and it's not smooth all the time, but we're going to, how can we give more to those around us? And I appreciate you doing that. The contribution of this church has been very generous. We're hoping to be able to hire more, to grow, and to explore other areas, even in the Pioneer Valley, of where we can bring the gospel and bring this community to. And we're able to do that because of the generosity of so many of you. We have this beautiful thing called the Benevolence Fund in our church. And so many of our members have been able to go, hey, I'm in a hard time, I'm in a hard moment, things are challenging, the unexpected burden has come up, and we have money that you've given that our board, with so much integrity and so much care and so much thought and so much prayer, carefully distributes to those in need in our congregation. Like, we're such a generous, the beauty is that a lot of times, one of the amazing things is that we get to those needs, and before we can get the process done, which is they're really quick about it, somebody else has just walked up to them in fellowship and taken care of it. Like, you're just a generous people. God wants to convince you even more of his generosity. And I think that's going to mean us learning to follow Jesus into even more uncomfortable places at times. Dallas Willard would say, we will do what we are. We will do what we are. Meaning, if you are convinced there's not enough and you're greedy in your view of things, then you will be that way towards your neighbor. If that's who you are, that's what you will do. But likewise, if you're convinced that there's more than enough, that God is generous, and so you participate in the life of God in Jesus, you will love your neighbor. You will be generous towards your neighbor. What are some practices that can help us move towards participating with God and be formed into these kind of generous people? Here are three that I'll bring up, and I actually have a fourth one that we were praying about on the way over to church today. Sabbath. And I know that, again, we come from different places traditionally, and in our fellowship, we don't teach that Sabbath is some part of a necessary part of your covenant with God in the New Testament, and it certainly has nothing to do with a matter of remission of sins or not. That's not what we're talking about. But Sabbath as a practice of being like God in the world and taking intentional time to rest and delight in God. And in that way, Sabbath is a bit of a practice of salvation for your mind and your body. Are you with me right there? It's learning to stop earning and working and accomplishing for a period of time on a regular basis and to just rest and delight and worship God. It is life-giving. It is so good for the soul, so good for the mind, so good for the body. And every time, we practice this weekly, every time we go into Sabbath, we just feel like, oh, God, you are so kind. You are so generous. And throughout the day, it's just moments where you're going, God, you're so generous. It has reminded me, taught me, put it into my life and calendar and into my habits as a human of God's generosity. It's helping me be more generous towards others. Hospitality, offering your space and your time and your attention to love others through your home or your dinner table or your just who you are. But it's an act of grace to others to say, I am going to host you and love you and show you God's goodness in hospitality. And it transforms you into seeing God and to seeing him as hospitable and him hosting you throughout the world. Jesus says it's more blessed to give than to receive. Why? Because you start to see God. Hospitality is one way we can get at this. Generosity, a regular practice of giving to the church, to the poor, to the needy, to the needs that come up. It does something inside of you when you're generous. It does something to who you are. It transforms you. It transforms your view of God and the opportunities of seeing God in the world. The Bible begins with this poetic image. Oh, I promised one more, the fourth one. And this is to take time to be grateful. Amen. Which is part of what we do on Sabbath. We take time to be grateful. It's a really intentional space. But Rachel's been doing this little practice every day. And some might have heard it like the prayer of examine. These are practices. Some of you have journals that you write things down in. But taking time to just have some gratitude on a daily basis to go, God, thank you. It's a little phone alarm on your phone to just go, God, thank you. Thank you for my health. Thank you for my job. Thank you for my family. Thank you for the food that's before me. Thank you. Thank you. A practice of just being grateful in a world that says you don't have enough. It will transform you. God's gratitude, God's generosity is trying to form in you a generous person, to cultivate a generous community that bears the image of this generous God to the world. And though we live in a fallen world of competition and envy and greed, we can learn from Jesus and from looking at birds and flowers how to see things in ways that the world does not see them, and to show the world things that they did not think existed. Like the kingdom of heaven come through Jesus. Amen.